Our next speaker is Professor Marcos Cueto, who's a professor of the history of science and health at Cruz in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. He has previously been a professor at the Universidad Peruana Cayetano Heredia and has been a visiting professor to a number of universities, including Stanford, Princeton, Columbia, and New York University. He's the author of The Cold War and Deadly Fevers, Malaria Eradication in Mexico. And I think a lot of us that studied global health institutions grew up learning about these institutions, including the Pan American Health Organization and the World Health Organization, from Professor Cueto. So we're honored to have him come today to talk to us about accountability in the history of the World Health Organization. Professor Cueto.
Okay. Thank you very much for the organizers. I only have one slide that is basically an outline of my paper, and is slightly different from the paper that I sent about a week ago, because it has a first section on the creation of the African office of the WHO, known as AFRO. And I'm going to read, and I apologize for reading. And something else I want to mention is that I'm dealing with these 4 issues in the history of the WHO. And probably in the final paper, I will concentrate on 1 or 2, or probably I will find more links between them. For the moment, I think that an important common theme is Africa, as I will try to demonstrate in the paper. When the WHO was created in 1948, it did not have a clear and transparent system for disclosing its decision-making processes. The agency did have a double standard policy, namely one for developed countries and another one for colonies or developing countries, that was clear in some crucial decisions. This presentation will describe some cases in the history of the WHO to illustrate how double standards appear, for example, when the Regional Office for Africa was created, when some major programs were launched and ended, and also I will discuss how the election process of the Director General took place, at least since the 1980s, and recent campaign of the WHO on universal access to antiretrovirals. So first about AFRO. I believe that a case of AFRO, the creation of AFRO, demonstrates that multilateralism in international health always face challenges, not only from the legacy and persistence of European colonial medicine after World War II, but from its coexistence and competition with strong bilateral organizations. After the war, France, the UK, Belgium thought that the colonies that they had were crucial in the reconstruction of their countries and empires. During its initial years, late 40s and early 50s, the WHO and the UN had an ambivalent attitude towards colonization and tolerated the so-called civilizing mission of European powers in developing countries. Despite the fact that the Constitution of 1948 established that all nations should benefit of medical knowledge without distinction of race, religion, or social condition, the UN and the WHO followed the League of Nations trusted system created in the interwar period, a system that had code terms like mandates, dependencies, non-self-governed territories, all euphemisms for colonies. So at a time in the 40s and 50s, who were really accountable for what happened in international health in these countries were the Ministry for the Colonies of European countries. For example, in the case of Africa, they had to fill every year forms, send reports, many times seen as a formality, because at the same time, they had already bilateral agencies that conducted their own public health programs in the colonies. Between 1946 and 1948, there was a discussion at the WHO on what was going to be its architecture. And initially, only 5 regions were designed. The Americas, where already existed the Pan American Health Organization, Southeast Asia, Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Western Pacific. There was not going to be a regional office for Africa. Only after the protest of a Liberian medical doctor trained in Harvard, Dr. Togba, supported by Egypt and India and some Latin American countries, an organizing committee was created at the WHO to see if it was possible to create a regional office in Africa. At the same time, the European region of Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean argued that the north of Africa really belonged to Europe, and all of those colonies or countries were incorporated to the European region or to the Eastern Mediterranean region. As a result, AFRO, created in late 1951, embraced territories south of the Sahara, with only 2 independent countries at a time, Liberia and South Africa, and helped to define sub-Saharan Africa as an area that could not help itself, that needed help from abroad. All the other regions usually try to define a regional office, naming the countries, finding some common links between these countries in culture, language, or economic terms. In the case of Africa, it was defined by geography. Only in late 1951, when all the regional offices were already working, AFRO began to operate in Geneva and worked for a few years in Geneva with a Dutch director who had been a medical advisor to mining companies in South Africa. The first AFRO regional committee took place also in Geneva in 1951 with the full members that were Belgium, France, Spain, Liberia, South Africa, Portugal, and the UK. Colonies or newly independent countries were not invited, and over the years only achieved the status of associate members, and that will going to last until the mid-1960s in most places. In the third regional meeting in 1953, a decision was made to establish headquarters in Africa, despite the doubts of many officers who considered it premature. And the WHO negotiated with the French government for the establishment of an office in Brazzaville, rather than Monrovia, the capital where Togba was fighting to have the headquarters of the regional office. The issue of voting rights of colonial authorities in newly independent countries was debated several times in the World Health Assembly, dominated by European colonial doctors and a few former officers of the International Health Board of the Rockefeller Foundation. In this discussion, they did not approve the issue of voting rights for associate members. In 1953, the Dutch doctor was replaced by a Portuguese physician, François Cambournac, that had credentials as a tropical medicine doctor that had worked in the Ministry of the Colonies of Portugal, a country that retained colonies until the 1970s in Africa. And he was also a Rockefeller Fellow. And he remained in the office until the mid-1960s when an African was elected for the first time to be the regional director. At the same time, European colonial powers tried to limit Afro functions. They revived imperialism after World War II and promoted bilateral agencies and changed the political status of the colonies. The UK, a number of welfare acts are approved for investment in the colonies. They dropped the term British from the word British Commonwealth that existed before the war. France and Portugal changed their constitutions to use terms like French Union and overseas provinces, and for some time they argued that they really don't have colonies but national living abroad. And the UK, France, Belgium, and Portugal created their own bilateral agencies and unified these agencies in something called the Combined Commission for Technical Cooperation in Africa South of the Sahara, CCTA, with headquarters in London, that develop health, nutrition, and medical programs. The story of this commission has been studied by a few historians. I'm not going to tell it here now. U.S. foreign policy also supported colonialism at the time, in the 1950s, because it was considered as a tool to deter the ambitions of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Only in the second half of the 50s, after revolts in Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and Madagascar, and erosion of puppet regimes such as the Central African Federation, Europeans began to decide that they should change their policy towards Africa and promote more bilateralism in multilateral organizations such as the regional office of the WHO. So this is my first case that I can tell more later or in the paper. The second topic that I would like to address is how decisions are made or end at the WHO. Randall has already talked about this major program that was launched in 1955 called the Global Eradication of Malaria. But what is interesting is that in the discussions of the World Health Assembly that took place in Mexico City, of what really meant global, an important Rockefeller officer participates, Wiscandao, a Brazilian that was a former Rockefeller fellow, and they argue that it was not really going to be global, that sub-Saharan Africa had to be excluded, that was not ready for that campaign, that it was really a campaign to contain the disease, to create some examples of how other developing countries could achieve success in national control of malaria, and later other countries would follow. One of those countries were, for Latin America, Mexico. So it was not really literally global campaign. And the campaign failed for a series of reasons that I'm not going to address now. I think that Randall mentioned some of them: the cost of the campaign, the political support that the campaign had. And it suddenly ended in 1969 with another health assembly where there was not really an assessment of what had been wrong with the campaign. The cultural obstacles, for example, they found in many peasant communities that did not want to participate in a vertical campaign. And I think that not only then, but probably before, became a pattern in the WHO of that I would summarize, I don't know if my English is correct here, that when something goes wrong, change the subject. Find a new program, find a new deadline. No? Initially, the program was global eradication of malaria in 5 to 8 years. It was extended to 1969, and then they say, well, really, probably we should not do malaria eradication, but work in sexual and reproductive health, no? Or other programs. And something similar occurred with other programs that came from a different ideological tradition. For example, the primary health care that Randall has also described. It was enunciated in a conference in Alma-Ata in 1978, and the slogan was "Health for All by the year 2000." No? I was already a university professor in 1999. I remember going to class saying to my students that I was depressed that we're probably not going to make it. And a student told me, don't worry, professor, there's a new report of PAHO saying health for all in the 21st century. No? So they postponed again, and the slogan health for all became like the new goal for many countries. They forget the deadline, and it became an elusive goal. And what really happened is that this way of beginning or ending programs created a lot of fragmentation inside the agency and inside ministries of health. You had vertical programs and other holistic programs. And moreover, you had outside the WHO a number of organizations that are going to appear more frequently in the 1980s and 1990s. Randall has mentioned already some of them, the PPPs, the public-private partnerships. And I think this has a lot to do with accountability, because in an environment of fragmentation, formally, nobody is accountable. And really, who has the power is who has the money. What happens many times with the World Bank and bilateral agencies, and later with the Global Fund. And now the third case, how is the election process and how is this relevant to the discussion? There was a big discussion on the validity of the WHO in the 1980s that has to do with Ronald Reagan and neoliberalism and all his criticism to public institutions and multilateral institutions. And some of the criticism, I think, was correct. It was also taken by scholars in international health, like, for example, Fiona Godley, that began to publish a series of articles in the British Medical Journal, arguing that the WHO was inefficient, fragmented, corrupt, and lacked effective leadership. She also criticized very much all the processes at WHO where there was no scrutiny, especially the election of the Director General. The procedure, for those of you who don't know it, was as follows. Member states proposed candidates between June and September of the year before the election. These candidates were considered by the executive board, which nominated one person by secret ballot in a private session that usually took place in January of the election year. The board was made up of 32 delegates for 3-year terms drawn from all WHO member states. The winner of the election made by these 32 people was usually just confirmed in the World Health Assembly that took place usually in May in Geneva of that year. So there was no discussion, and the decision was basically made by 34 people. Although members of the executive board were appointed to vote in the name of their government, they had a significant degree of autonomy because of the secret ballot system. If necessary, members of the executive board could have several rounds of voting, with the lowest polling candidate eliminated at each stage until a winner emerged. In the past few elections, they needed 4 to 5 rounds, and the difference between the first and the second candidate was 1 or 2 votes. Criticism became more acute when Hiroshi Nagashima occupied the position, first in 1988. He won over a candidate supported by the US, a Brazilian, Carlos Guerra de Macedo, but also he ran against a candidate from Africa, Monecoso, the first regional director of the African Regional Office. Nakashima was criticized for a number of reasons: poor management, his confrontation with Jonathan Mann, but he got reelected in 1993 by a vote of 18 to 13 to a second term. And there were a lot of accusations that were under the table negotiations, support of Japan, bribes even to developing countries. And it was the only case where some members of the executive board demanded that the final decision should be made in the General Assembly. And there was a vote that Nakashima won 93 to 58. After Nakashima's tenure, some cosmetic changes were made, like the elaboration of a shortlist, yet interviews and selections occur in private sessions of the board. At the same time, the political side of the election became more intense. For example, members of countries were pressured to vote for a candidate as a demonstration of their loyalty to a bloc or a superpower like the US or the Soviet Union. And the latter, even if they didn't have a representation of the board, and even major donors had a strong influence in the election process. They could promote candidates or groom candidates if their first choice was defeated in the first round. And usually they oppose candidates that were openly for primary health care. Gro Harlem Brundtland was a candidate that replaced Nakashima, elected in 1988, only with 18 votes. And after the fourth round votes. And she won also against an African candidate, Ibrahim Samba from Gambia, the director of the prestigious Onchocerciasis Control Program. And what is interesting, probably I'll have a chance to say something about it later, I believe that she was the first director general that begins to use frequently the term accountability for programs in WHO. And it probably had a different meaning that we're trying to give it today. She used it more in the sense of the criticism made by neoliberal governments of the 1980s, and with the idea that WHO should not be an operating agency, but a normative agency with some supranational interventions. I think that was different from what we are talking today and what happened before. In 2002, Richard Horton, editor-in-chief of The Lancet, participated in a dialogue by radio with David Navarro, a senior policy officer of the WHO, formerly an officer of the British Bilateral Agency, an advisor to the UN in a number of diseases, food security, nutrition, and climate change. And Horton had these harsh words about the election process that was going to occur the next year. And this is a quote: "It is a process typical of a totalitarian regime of 20 years ago. It's secret, it's not transparent, it's not accountable. There will be no formal debate associated with the election process. A group of men will meet in a room in January and cast a vote secretly. We have no idea what the criteria will be following the election of the next Director General of the WHO." Starting in 2003, The Lancet established a section for a debate for the candidates. And WHO also responded, created a website where the candidates could present their proposals and engage in the debate. In 2003, Lee, the less known candidate from South Korea, won the election for one vote after the fifth round to Peter Piot, the very prestigious director of UNAIDS. Also, another candidate that was defeated that initially was thought was the front runner was Mokumbi. After the election, Mokumbi and several African representatives saw that they had to change the election system, and there was a lot of pressure for Lee, and they even introduced the idea of a rotation process that all regions should have a director in the following years. But Lee died, as you probably know, and there was an interim director for about a year. And in 2007, Margaret Chan was elected, and these reforms were not carried out. She also competed with Julio Freng, that was very close to winning the election, and again against Pascual Mokumbi. Chan was re-elected in 2012 in an election that there was no challenger. No? But there was an important decision made during his second term. The executive board, now formed by 34 people, would nominate a short list of 3 candidates chosen by a secret ballot. But the final decision was going to be made in the World Health Assembly held in May. The first time that this occurred was in May of this year. And as probably you know, was a very bitter campaign for 2 years with a candidate from the UK, David Navarro, that many people believe was going to win very easily the election, a candidate from Ethiopia, and a woman physician from Pakistan. But the vote of developing countries and of African countries was decisive in the victory, but almost 2/3 of the vote of Tedros, the candidate of Ethiopia. Not going to say anything about Tedros because he is just beginning, but the selection of an African candidate from a poor developing country would have been unlikely in the traditional process conducted by the executive board. There's a table in the paper that I sent of the elections between 1988 to the last one in where appears information of for how many votes each director general won and what other candidates lost the election at the time. And finally, I don't know how I'm on time. Okay. Finally, I want to say something about universal access to antiretrovirals and double standards. Most of the history of AIDS have concentrated on the first 15 years from the early 1980s to the mid-1990s, when there's a story of stigma and prevention efforts and NGOs. But only recently there has begun to appear some studies on what happened with the history of AIDS after the emergence of antiretrovirals. And that is one project that I'm interested in developing now. In 2001, a global consensus emerged. Universal access to antiretrovirals should be a reality in developing countries. Previously, from 1996 to 2000, a policy of double standards existed with regard to these drugs. Global health agencies, notably the World Bank, USAID, and the WHO, argued that developing countries should concentrate on prevention, early testing, and counseling, and not on treatment programs because it was not cost-effective. As late as 2001, an officer of USAID argued that these drugs could not be used in Africa because Africans did not use watches and thus were incapable to keep a strict regime of drugs. The assumption was that only rich countries could afford to pay for the expensive drugs that were about $12,000 per person per year. This double standard policy was promoted against activists and governments of some developing countries like Brazil, South Africa, Thailand, and Senegal that promoted free access to these drugs, usually by producing or exporting or importing AIDS generic medication. Transnational pharmaceutical companies consider this use of generics as acts of piracy against intellectual property and denounced Brazil and South Africa in 96 and 98 for promoting generic drugs, and asked the World Trade Organization, set up in 1994, to intervene in these and other cases in accordance with the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights agreements, known as TRIPS, and also pressured the US government to place these countries on a watch list that was usually the first step towards sanctions. The double standard policy was criticized by activists and journalists that portray pharmaceuticals as ruthless monopolies that deny life-saving drugs for millions of poor people. Another problem for this company was that Cipla, an Indian generic company, began to sell antiretroviral for a few $100s per year. And also other countries like Brazil began to produce some of the drugs needed for treatment at the time for much less money than pharmaceutical companies asked for. Since the late 1990s, the CEOs of these companies began to hold meetings with agencies like the WHO to try what they call differential pricing, namely price reductions for some developing countries, support a few pilot programs where ARVs were freely distributed, and make donations on a case-by-case basis. But they never engaged in the discussion that was going on at the time if these drugs were really public goods. They never gave away the right to patents, and they demanded a WHO to favor patent drugs over generics and ensure that lower-priced medicines that they were donating would not be diverted to higher-priced markets. There were a number of meetings at the turn of the 21st century, the industrialized countries of the G8, United Nations, the United Nations General Assembly special session. Kofi Annan was very active in several meetings in Africa. There was a famous meeting in Africa in 2001 where he asked for the creation of a special fund for AIDS that should have at least $7 to $10 billion to operate effectively. And it's basically to distribute drugs. The money that began to appear was less than this amount. Initially, it was only 200 million from the US, the UK, and Japan. Each country contributed with 200 million, and the Gates Foundation with another 100 million. To keep this amount in perspective, in the same year, in 2001, the initial amount approved by the US Congress was 79 billion to pay for the first phase of the war in Iraq. Another problem was that even at that time, many heads of bilateral agencies saw that drugs should be a component of aid programs that should not be the center in developing countries, that should still concentrate on prevention. And that was the beginning of the fund, but what is interesting is that the fund is created not as a UN agency, and it is made very clear at the beginning that it was not going to be a UN agency because there was an opposition of the industrialized countries to have another multilateral organization. It was going to be more like a PPP, a public-private partnership with headquarters in Geneva. It only had $1 to $1.5 billion, much less of the amount of money requested by Kofi Annan. Also, there were a number of meetings that defended the idea that nothing in the TRIPS prevented governments from issuing compulsory licenses in health emergencies. One of these meetings was a ministerial conference of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And another effect of this consensus on ARVs was launching of the program by the WHO. The new director then in 2003 was Lee, in association with Cueto of UNAIDS, called 3x5, that you probably know, 3 million people receiving antiretrovirals by the year 2005. What is interesting is that similarly to the global malaria eradication program, they knew from the very beginning that it was not really universal. There was even an article in Science by an officer of the WHO saying, well, this really is going to deliver drugs for about half the people in need of these drugs. But at least it will be a step in the right direction. Many activists in many developing countries see it as a victory and supported the program. But after 2 years of work, it was clear that they were not going to achieve the target. And I'm not going to go into the discussion of why the program failed. Probably the deadline was unrealistic. But what is interesting is that also similarly to primary health care, they changed the target. It was not 3x5, but universal access to antiretrovirals in the future, probably in the distant future. And there were a number of problems that were going on the side. In 2003, Tommy G. Thompson, the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services, became chairman of the Global Fund, and he clearly makes a statement that he doesn't favor 3x5, but because it has no business plan. That is another code word similar to cost effectiveness. And also, these are the years of PEPFAR. And as you probably know, PEPFAR, because it has a director that was a former CEO of a pharmaceutical company, Randall Tobias, favor patent drugs, not generics, and celebrates the prevention program of Uganda that has the famous ABC recommendations, the abstinence recommendation. They never mention Brazil or South Africa or Thailand that had a long story of fighting against AIDS. There was some change after a few years when Tobias is replaced, but there was a slow return to a double standard policy because, for example, pharmaceutical companies and industrialized nations began to enforce what they call TRIP+ provisions and bilateral free trade agreements with strong protection of patents and restrictions on the use of generics and compulsory licenses. After Lee died in 2006, the WHO was no longer a champion for access to antiretrovirals. In 2007, Margaret Chan became the new Director General and de-emphasized compulsory licensing and use of generics. And she even criticized the decision of the government of Thailand to issue a compulsory license for drugs, for 3 drugs, not only used for AIDS, saying that it was necessary to find a balance between brand name medicine and generics. In February of 2007, members of international NGOs and associations of people living with AIDS published an open letter criticizing her, saying, "Your predecessor at the WHO, Dr. Lee, led a bold and courageous campaign to treat 3 million people with AIDS. Through the campaign, failed to reach its goal. It helped to create the momentum to produce affordable generic medicines. We need you as a world leader in public health to take the lead and keep the spirit of Dr. Lee initiative alive, especially the promotion of generic medicines, which has proven over and over to be the most important factor in decreasing the cost of medicines." After the economic crisis of 2008, the funds and political commitment for fighting AIDS declined. The concept of universal access to ARVs and the empowerment of developing nations that in the late 1990s began to represent the activist goal, lives matter more than profits, obliterated. The aspiration to use treatment as an entry point to reinforce health systems became a distant objective. A new meaning became hegemonic. Just universal access for a distant future was an ideal to be sought progressively without major changes in health systems. It was separated, for example, from the promotion of gender-based human rights in developing countries. And I have a couple of paragraphs, like a final reflection on this. Okay. And the lack of accountability contributed to the erosion of multilateralism in the second half of the 20th century, and also eroded the power of some of the idealistic and ambitious goals that multilateral agencies raised from the very beginning. Probably one of the most well-known goals appears in the preamble of the Constitution of the WHO, that health is not only the absence of disease, but basically the right of people to achieve certain living standards, to enjoy health. But with the eradication campaigns that Randall has described in the 50s and 70s, health was the absence of disease. The philosophy behind those campaigns was that health was the absence of disease. And nobody questioned, and even to this day, they maintain that broad statement in the Constitution of the WHO. Universal access to antiretrovirals also ended as an elusive goal, and its deadline has been postponed several times. If I'm not mistaken, now the deadline is 2030. However, these transformations paid formal tribute to the ambitious enunciations to which they were really subverting, usually postponing their full realization to a distant future. In some, health ideas lost the revolutionary potential envisioned by the creators and frequently became hollow, unreachable promises. It might be that international agencies or multilateral agencies that work in societies marked by acute inequalities need ideological hollow promises to function and maintain an appearance of a bond among its very different officers and member countries. It might be that these elusive egalitarian ideals disguise inequalities in economic and political power. But it might also be that they exist to inspire resilient and tireless actors inside and outside this agency, multilateral agencies, that seek to change the rules of social and health inequalities. Thank you.